First, let's quickly explain what logbooking your workout even means. Essentially, this just means recording what you did each workout over time. Logbooking can be done in a physical book or paper, on an Excel spreadsheet, or using a mobile app. So you record the exercises you performed, the number of sets performed, how many reps you performed each set, and what load was used. You could also take notes about how the session felt, how long it took, and so on. The main reason we record our workouts is for the purposes of progressive overload. We want to make sure that we are doing more reps, load, volume, or progress some other variable each workout. We can also look back at previous workouts to see how our performance now compares to the past. And this makes sense. We want to progress over time to induce a greater and greater stimulus. And if we can string enough progressive workouts together over several months and years, we can make significant gains. However, the application of progressive overload, and therefore the necessity of logbooking, differs for strength versus hypertrophy training. When it comes to strength, the goal outcome is to lift more weight over time. So the reps and load performed over time is directly related to the outcome. In this case, the application of progressive overload should be to increase lifting performance over time. And therefore, logbooking your workouts can be useful to keep track of lifting performance to ensure we are progressing over time. But when it comes to hypertrophy, the goal adaptation isn't to lift more weight over time like it is with strength. The adaptation we are after is an increase in the size of the muscle. The reps and load we lift are just ways to induce a hypertrophic stimulus. And while it is generally beneficial to increase reps and load over time for muscle growth, there are also other training variables that influence the hypertrophic stimulus too. So what we want to avoid is increasing reps and load at the expense of the hypertrophic stimulus. And as we will discuss later in this video, other variables can influence the application of progressive overload. Another reason to logbook your workouts is for the purpose of having a general training plan. In other words, a plan which tells you what exercises you will perform on what days, for how many sets, and so on. Having a general training plan is usually beneficial for hypertrophy training for a number of reasons. First is that it allows you to adjust variables from a big picture perspective. You can adjust volume, exercise selection, exercise order, and the overall training split to suit your goals, preferences, and lifestyle constraints. This is usually helpful for both long-term muscle growth outcomes as well as managing fatigue. As a result, a training plan also helps you to know what you are going to do in the gym each workout. So it eliminates the decision-making process of what muscle groups you want to train today, what exercises you will perform, and so on. You just need to look at the plan and execute what it says. And finally, it keeps your routine consistent each week. You can still achieve muscle growth by frequently changing your routine, but ideally we want to perform a consistent training program for multiple weeks consecutively. This is so that we can spend enough time adapting to a stimulus before changing it. So while logbooking your workouts has benefits, it can also have some potential downsides in some cases. While the act of recording your workouts isn't an issue itself, it can cause some less than ideal behaviors, either intentionally or unintentionally. Going back to the discussion on progressive overload, logbooking can help us make sure we are adding reps and/or load over time. Although adding reps or load shouldn't come at the expense of other important variables. We don't want to sacrifice the hypertrophic stimulus just for the purpose of recording more reps or load in our logbook. Progressive overload should more so be seen as a consequence of building muscle over time, rather than something we actively need to do each workout. There are a few variables that we might unintentionally change as a result of logbooking our workouts. The first is lifting technique. The technique used to maximize muscle growth is generally not the same technique as that which allows you to lift the heaviest loads. To maximize muscle growth, we generally want to lift in the following ways. Avoid using too much external momentum, ensuring the majority of the movement is performed by the target muscle group. Include the lengthened range of an exercise, either by performing full range of motion or partial range in the lengthened position. And actively control the eccentric phase rather than allowing the load to fall under the forces of gravity. Lifting with these general technique guidelines will usually limit the load you are able to use. And this isn't an issue for muscle growth, since we aren't necessarily trying to lift the most weight at all costs, we are trying to maximize internal stress of the target muscle group. For example, this study compared the effects of performing squat training to different depths. 17 untrained males performed back squats for 3 sets of 8 to 10 reps with progressively increasing loads 2 times per week for 10 weeks. Half the subjects performed squats to full depth, defined as 140 degrees knee flexion, while the other half performed partial range of motion squats, defined as 90 degrees knee flexion. As we can see, the group training with partial squats were able to train with heavier loads on average throughout the course of the training program, shown in the orange, compared with the full range of motion training, shown in the blue. Although after 10 weeks, it was found that the deep squats resulted in slightly superior increases in quadriceps, adductors, and glute max muscle volume compared with the partial squats. So if we are adamant about beating last week's performance, we might unintentionally change technique slightly to get 1 or 2 more reps. And if we do this for multiple weeks or months consecutively, our technique can end up looking quite different to when we first introduced the lift. In some cases, this might just mean a slightly inferior stimulus, or maybe an equivalent stimulus but with more fatigue. Or in a worse scenario, it could result in joint or connective tissue pain or injury over time. Another variable that might be changed due to the behavior of logbooking is rest periods. Longer rest periods provide more recovery time and allow us to be less fatigued on subsequent sets. As a result, we are usually able to perform a little better on each subsequent set. So the potential issue here is that we might intentionally or unintentionally rest a little longer between sets as a way to achieve more reps or load. And if we beat the logbook because of longer rest periods, this isn't really true progression. More reps or load weren't achieved because of muscle growth, it simply occurred because longer rest was permitted. Although this isn't going to have a negative impact on muscle growth. In fact, longer rest periods might even allow us to provide a slightly superior stimulus in some cases. This meta-analysis analyzed the body of evidence on how rest periods influence hypertrophy. The researchers categorized interventions into rest periods of different durations. These were 1 minute or less, longer than 1 minute but shorter than 2 minutes, 2 minutes or longer but less than 3 minutes, or 3 minutes and longer. It was found that significant muscle growth was able to be achieved with all rest intervals. However, resting less than 1 minute resulted in slightly inferior muscle growth compared with 1 to 2 minutes rest. And also, resting too long seemed to be slightly inferior for muscle growth too. So while resting longer isn't necessarily bad for hypertrophy, the point is that the numbers in the logbook aren't really comparable if rest periods were different. You could obviously control this by simply timing your rest periods with a stopwatch. That way, if progression occurs, we know that it wasn't due to longer acute recovery. But if rest periods aren't equated, it doesn't really make sense to try and compare performance between workouts. The next potential issue with logbooking is the need to get into a high psychological arousal state. If we haven't actually made true performance progression, we might end up just increasing our psychological arousal to beat the logbook. This could be via external motivation or by adding stimulants before your workout, such as increasing caffeine intake. While it isn't a big deal if you get amped up for a workout sporadically, it can become an issue if it becomes a necessity to train effectively. If you are only able to beat your past performance by increasing psychological arousal, then you will probably need to do the same thing in your next workout and each workout after that. So the effects of this can compound over time and be detrimental over multiple weeks and months. Some potential issues resulting from this include increasing your systemic fatigue, which could lead to an increased risk of demotivation or burnout, and a high stimulant intake can interfere with sleep, which further increases the reliance on stimulants to train effectively. And the last potential downside with logbooking is that it might promote demotivation. At some point, our rate of muscle growth and strength gains will slow down. If you stick with lifting long enough, it could take multiple months or even years to notice any significant progress in terms of visual appearance and lifting performance. So logbooking in a way can just reinforce the fact that you aren't progressing much in the short term. This can make each workout seem like a waste of time, or maybe that your entire lifting journey is a waste of time, when in reality, you are likely providing an effective hypertrophy stimulus. And if you stay consistent and string together enough effective workouts, you will likely make good progress over time. As a more advanced lifter, it can be helpful to focus more on the internal stimulus rather than external performance during a workout for the purposes of hypertrophy training. So while logbooking certainly has some advantages, it could also potentially have some small disadvantages for some people in some cases. So if we wanted to train effectively without logbooking, how can this be done? And how would we know that we are training progressively over time? Here are a few key points which can help lifters train effectively without needing to logbook their workouts. First is that you want to have a general training plan in place. At the bare minimum, you would want to know what muscle groups you will train on what days. But ideally, we would also want to plan what specific exercises will be performed each workout and how many sets of each exercise. You could also prescribe rep ranges, proximity to failure targets, and rest times for each exercise, but this isn't entirely necessary for reasons we will discuss soon. For example, a general training plan might look something like this. A more vague program might just include which muscle groups will be targeted on each day. And this can work well, but it might be a little better to be more specific. We probably want to specify which exercises we will perform so that we can keep things a little more consistent each week. And it would probably also be a good idea to have a plan of how many sets will be performed for each exercise too, so that we can keep track of our total weekly volume. And if you want to be even more specific, you could plan the approximate rep ranges you want to work within and the specific proximity to failure you want to train to. Once we have a general training plan in place, the next important consideration is to train close to failure. This essentially just means that we take each set fairly close to failure rather than to aim for a specific number of reps. By doing so, we are essentially making each set maximally effective, regardless of the exact load or number of reps we achieve. This systematic review aimed to establish if the total number of sets performed is a valid method to quantify volume for hypertrophy training. It was concluded that when training close to failure, each set seems to be similarly hypertrophic when training anywhere within the approximate 6 to 20 rep range. So while you can prescribe a specific rep target if you want, it isn't mandatory. You can just take each set close to failure, and as long as your reps aren't too low or too high, the hypertrophic stimulus you achieve will be essentially the same. As a practical recommendation, we should take each set at least 3 reps before failure to maximize muscle growth. A potential benefit of training without logbooking is the fact that it can shift your focus more towards lifting technique rather than performance. As discussed, the technique that provides the most effective hypertrophic stimulus is usually not the same as that which allows you to lift the most weight. So while the logbook can often shift us into a performance mindset, training without the logbook can allow us to train with a technique-focused mindset. This means focusing on what technique allows us to maximally stress the target muscle rather than focusing on trying to beat last week's performance. Although we also want to make sure we are still training sufficiently close to failure, we just want to do this using effective technique. So assuming we are training close to failure and focusing on effective technique, we then need to adjust the load used. The load we use should be adjusted based on 3 primary factors. The first is based on the rep range we want to work within. As discussed, you could either have a pre-planned rep range that you are aiming to train within, or simply work within rep ranges that feel productive and orthopedically friendly on your joints. And then you simply need to adjust the load used based on rep performance. Obviously, lifting a heavier weight means fewer reps are able to be performed, and lighter loads permit more reps. You can also adjust the load from set to set if rep performance decreases too much across your sets. Second is to adjust load based on technique. Sometimes changes in lifting technique can influence the load we can lift. For the purposes of hypertrophy training, the external load isn't really important. It is the internal muscle stress which we want to prioritize. So it makes sense to prioritize technique first and then adjust the load used according to technique. And third is to adjust the load we use for the purposes of progressive overload. Since we are taking each set close to failure, progressive overload is essentially built into the system. As you build muscle mass over time, you will naturally be able to perform more reps and eventually increase load. So while you don't need to record your rep and load performance, you can just increase load once rep performance exceeds your target or the range you prefer to train within. And over time, you should naturally be able to progress as a result of increases in muscle mass. And finally, we want to adopt more of an internal focus when training without a logbook. This refers to focusing on providing a good hypertrophic stimulus each set. This is in opposition to more of an external focus, where you are focused on the weight used and the number of reps performed. You can shift to more of an internal focus by concentrating on your lifting technique and taking the target muscle close to failure. We can also use internal feedback to make small adjustments to our technique, exercise selection, load selection, and so on. This includes using sensations like the mind-muscle connection, muscle pump, stretch under load, and muscle soreness as a gauge of the stimulus we induced. Check out the video linked in the description for more details on these sensations. To summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. Logbooking our workouts has some key benefits. It provides us with a general training plan to follow and also allows us to monitor the application of progressive overload. And while performance is a direct indicator of progression for strength training, it isn't perfectly indicative of muscle growth. So in some cases, logbooking your workouts can have some potential downsides. Too much of a focus on progressive overload can sometimes mean we subconsciously change our technique, adjust rest periods, or increase psychological arousal just to beat the logbook. This makes it difficult to monitor true progression, and in some cases it can slightly inhibit the hypertrophic stimulus. Furthermore, it can be demotivating as an advanced lifter to see minimal changes in lifting performance over long periods of time, despite the fact that an effective stimulus is being achieved. For these reasons, some people might prefer to train without logbooking, which is a completely valid way to train. To do so, we want to have a general training plan in place so we know what exercises will be performed on which days for how many sets. Take each set close to failure to maximize the hypertrophic stimulus. Focus on lifting with a technique that maximally stresses the target muscle. Adjust load according to rep ranges, technique, and rate of progression. And adopt more of an internal focus on providing an effective stimulus rather than an external focus on performance. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.